I came home early and found my sister sitting alone crying her eyes out. Meanwhile, her in-laws were in my home office going through private papers about my house. When I confronted them, they told me it was a family matter. So I made them regret ever setting foot here. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, I was never the favorite. That title belonged exclusively to my younger sister Chloe. While I spent my teenage years hunched over laptops teaching myself to code and building firewalls, Chloe was the undisputed golden child. She was a pageant queen, a cheerleader, and eventually a college graduate, who married into what my parents believed was elite white society. Preston Sinclair and his parents Beatrice and Richard were old money, or at least they projected the illusion of it. My parents Marcus and Yvonne practically worshipped the ground the Sinclairs walked on. They viewed Chloe's marriage as the ultimate elevation of our family status. They bent over backward to accommodate the Sinclairs constantly seeking their validation and approval. Meanwhile, my career in cybersecurity was treated like a cute little hobby. My parents would proudly tell their friends about Preston's vague entrepreneurial ventures, but when asked about me, they would just say, "I fix computers for a living." They had absolutely no idea that my firm secured the networks for half the banks in the state. They did not know that my net worth eclipsed the Sinclair family's wildest dreams. I liked keeping my life private and peaceful. I never felt the need to flaunt my wealth or correct their assumptions. But peace is the very first casualty when you invite toxic people into your home. I had wrapped up a major contract in California 2 days early. I was exhausted, craving nothing more than a hot shower and the quiet sanctuary of my Buckhead estate. The house is a modern architectural masterpiece, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. It is entirely paid off, bought with my own hard-earned cash. When I pulled into my driveway, I expected total silence. Instead, I found a luxury SUV parked carelessly across my front walkway, crushing a bed of hydrangeas I had just planted. I unlocked the front door and dropped my overnight bag in the foyer. The first thing I heard was the sound of muffled sobbing. I walked toward the kitchen and found Chloe slumped over my marble island. Her perfect silk blouse was wrinkled, and her makeup was running down her face in dark streaks. Chloe had always been the picture of poised perfection. She was taught from a young age that a woman must always maintain appearances, so seeing her completely broken sent a sharp spike of alarm through my chest. I rushed over and asked her what was wrong. She just shook her head, refusing to meet my eyes and burying her face deeper into her hands. Before I could press her further, a loud thud echoed from the east wing of the house. The noise came directly from my private home office. I left Chloe at the island and walked swiftly down the hallway. My office door, which is strictly off-limits to guests, was wide open. I stepped inside and could not believe the scene unfolding in front of me. Beatrice Sinclair was standing in the center of the room, clutching a stack of my financial folders. Richard was actively rummaging through the drawers of my mahogany desk, tossing loose papers onto the floor. And Preston, my arrogant brother-in-law, was kneeling on the floor, pulling documents straight out of my personal wall safe. I had left the safe unlocked earlier that week in a rush to catch my flight. It was a rare mistake on my part, but one I never expected my own family to exploit. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I demanded, stepping fully into the room. Preston jumped slightly, but quickly recovered his composure. He stood up, brushing dust off his expensive tailored slacks, and offered absolutely no apology. Instead, he gave me a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. Beatrice did not even flinch. She adjusted her diamond necklace and looked at me as if I were a confused trespasser in my own home. "We are simply looking for the property deeds and mortgage papers," Beatrice announced. Her tone was dripping with that specific brand of entitled arrogance. "We know you keep them in here somewhere." I stepped forward and snatched the folders right out of her manicured hands. "You have lost your mind if you think you can break into my office and go through my safe. Get out of my house right now." Beatrice rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. "Let us not be hysterical, Zuri. We are not stealing anything. Your parents asked us to retrieve the documents. Preston's startup is going through a temporary cash flow issue, and we are simply executing the collateral agreement. I stared at her genuinely trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. Collateral agreement, I asked, my voice dropping an octave. For what? It is a family matter, Beatrice said coldly. She lifted her chin, looking down her nose at me with a gaze designed to make me feel small. We are handling the adult business here. Please step outside and let us finish our work. The disrespect was staggering. They were standing in a house I paid for, rifling through a safe I owned, and attempting to dismiss me like an unruly child. They truly believed that because of their background, they inherently had more authority in my own home than I did. Preston chimed in, attempting to sound reasonable, but only sounding more patronizing. Look, Zuri, you just do computer stuff. You do not understand how high-level corporate finance works. My company needs a $3 million capital injection by tomorrow morning. Your parents agreed to leverage this property to secure the loan. It is for the good of the family name. You should be proud to help us out. I let out a laugh that was entirely devoid of humor. You are trying to mortgage my house to save your failing business, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. And you think you have the right to just walk in and take it? Before Preston could respond, the front door chimed loudly, and rushed footsteps echoed down the hallway. Marcus and Yvonne. My own parents burst into the office. They were breathless, looking frantic and highly defensive. I turned to them, expecting them to be horrified by what the Sinclairs were doing. I expected my father to step up and defend his daughter's property. I expected my mother to demand answers from these intruders. Instead, my mother marched right past the Sinclairs and grabbed my arm. Her grip was painfully tight, and she looked at me with an expression of intense disappointment. My mother, Yvonne, marched right past Beatrice and Richard without so much as a second glance. She did not question why they were standing in my private sanctuary. She did not ask why my safe was wide open. Instead, she lunged toward me, her manicured fingers digging into my forearm with the sharp, desperate grip of a hawk. Her eyes, usually so careful to project southern elegance, were wide and frantic. Give them the papers, Zuri, she ordered, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of panic and authority. Give Preston the documents right now. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling a cold numbness spread from my chest to my fingertips. I yanked my arm out of her grip, stepping back to put distance between us. What are you talking about? I demanded. Why are these people tearing apart my office? My father, Marcus, stepped into the room, smoothing the lapels of his golf jacket. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of a wealthy patriarch in total control. Your brother-in-law is facing a minor liquidity issue with his new tech startup. He needs a $3 million loan by tomorrow to keep the development cycle moving. We agreed to put this house up as collateral to secure the funding for him. It is a simple financial maneuver, Zuri. Do not make a scene in front of our family. A harsh, bitter laugh erupted from my throat before I could stop it. I looked from my father to my mother, then to the smug faces of the Sinclair family. You agreed to put this house up as collateral, I asked, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. My house. The house I bought outright in cash 4 years ago. Yvonne stepped forward again, her face twisting into an ugly scowl. Do not be selfish, Zuri. We are a family, and family helps each other. We are on the utility bills. We have a stake in this property. We have every right to use it to save your sister's marriage. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the heavy air of the office. I looked my mother dead in the eyes, stripping away decades of forced respect. You are on the water and electricity bills for one reason only, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Because you begged me. You begged me to add your name to the municipal accounts just so you could sit under the hairdryer at Gloria's salon and wave the envelopes around. You wanted to brag to your church friends that you co-owned a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. You own nothing here. Not the bricks, not the land. And certainly not the equity. Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of fake shock, while Richard shook his head in disgust, but it was Preston who decided to step forward. He crossed his arms over his pastel polo shirt, looking at me with a gaze so steeped in white privilege and unearned arrogance that it made my skin crawl. Listen to me very carefully, Zuri, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. You are just a mid-level IT worker, a keyboard pusher. You do not understand how real corporate finance works. My family, the Sinclair family, lowered ourselves to welcome your sister into our circle. We elevated your entire bloodline simply by associating with you. My startup is going to change the world, but it needs capital right now. The least you can do as the unmarried childless sister is sacrifice a piece of property to maintain the honor and standing of your family. You owe us this. Beatrice immediately chimed in, stepping up beside her son. Preston is absolutely right. We are doing you a favor by integrating this property into our portfolio. A single black woman living alone in a neighborhood like this. It is highly unusual and frankly bound to attract the wrong kind of attention. Preston will ensure you are fairly compensated with stock options once his company goes public. You should be thanking him on your knees for allowing you to be part of something greater than your little computer repair job. The room felt like it was closing in. The suffocating weight of their combined arrogance, the deep-seated racism masked as financial advice, and the absolute betrayal by my own parents created a toxic pressure in the air. My father looked at me sternly, completely validating the insults Preston and Beatrice had just hurled at me. You heard them, Zuri, Marcus commanded. Stop acting like an ungrateful child. Chloe deserves to live a life of comfort, and Preston is providing that for her. You have no husband, you have no children. You spend all your time locked in this house staring at screens. Hand over the deed. It is the only way you will ever truly contribute to the legacy of this family. I did not scream, I did not cry. I did not try to explain to them that the startup Preston was running was a complete joke, or that my little computer job generated more revenue in a single quarter than the entire Sinclair family had seen in 3 generations. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the custom application I had coded myself for the estate's smart home security system. I tapped a single bright red icon on the screen. Instantly, the heavy steel-reinforced doors of the office slid shut with a loud mechanical clank, locking automatically. The motorized blackout blinds dropped down over the floor-to-ceiling windows in perfect unison, plunging the room into a cool, artificial twilight, illuminated only by the sleek LED strips running along the ceiling. Beatrice let out a sharp yelp of surprise, grabbing her husband's arm. Preston's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sudden apprehension. You have exactly 60 seconds to get off my property, I announced. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion, echoing off the locked doors. If you are still standing in this room when that minute is up, the perimeter alarms will sound, and the Atlanta police will arrive to arrest all 3 of you for breaking and entering attempted grand larceny and trespassing. Richard puffed out his chest, trying to mask his panic. You cannot lock us in here. This is false imprisonment. We will sue you for everything you have. You have 45 seconds left, I replied, staring right through him. The doors will unlock for exactly 10 seconds to let you out. Choose wisely. Yvonne grabbed my shoulders, shaking me violently. Zuri, stop this madness right now. You are ruining everything. You are embarrassing us in front of the Sinclairs. How are we supposed to look them in the eye after this? If Preston goes under, Chloe loses her mansion. Do you want your sister to be a divorced, broke single mother? I slowly removed my mother's hands from my shoulders, disgusted by her touch. I turned to look at my father, who was vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. If you want to play the wealthy savior so badly, Dad, why do not you fund his failing company yourself? I asked, tilting my head. Oh wait, you cannot, because you do not have $3 million. In fact, why do not you give Preston the Black American Express card currently sitting in your wallet? The one with my name on the primary account. The one where you and Mom have secretly racked up $40,000 in debt over the last 2 months, buying designer suits and hosting country club dinners just to impress these exact people standing next to you. The truth dropped into the room like a live grenade. Beatrice and Richard snapped their heads toward my parents, their eyes widening in shock and immediate disgust. The carefully constructed illusion of Marcus and Yvonne being wealthy, independent socialites shattered into a million pieces right in front of their elite white in-laws. They were exposed as frauds living entirely off the very daughter they were currently trying to rob. Marcus's face contorted into a mask of absolute terrifying rage. His pride, the only thing he truly valued in this world, had been decimated. He let out a primal growl, stepping forward with his hand raised high. Before I could even brace myself, he swung his arm with all his might. The heavy strike landed squarely against my left cheek. The sharp cracking sound of the slap echoed violently around the locked office. My head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A blinding sting radiated across my face, and the metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth where my teeth had caught my inner lip. The entire room fell into a deathly, stunned silence. I stood perfectly still for a moment, letting the physical pain wash over me, feeling the last remaining thread of familial loyalty snap and wither away. I slowly turned my head back to face the man who contributed half my DNA. I wiped a small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth with my thumb, my eyes locking onto his. I did not see a father anymore. I saw a target. The sharp crack of the slap still echoed off the mahogany walls. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on my father. I did not blink. I did not shed a tear. I simply stared at him until the bravado melted from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization of what he had just done. The digital timer on my desk flashed 10 seconds. The smart home system chimed a crisp, synthetic note, and the heavy, reinforced doors slid open. "Get out," I said. My voice was a dead flat calm that frightened even me. Richard and Beatrice Sinclair did not hesitate. They scrambled toward the hallway, their false, aristocratic dignity completely evaporating in their desperation to escape the perimeter alarm. Preston bolted right behind them. He moved so fast he actually shoved his own wife out of the way to reach the doorway first. Chloe stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug, sending her sprawling onto the floor. My father grabbed my mother by the arm, dragging her out of the office. Neither of them looked back at the daughter they had just assaulted. The heavy doors slid shut again, locking with a definitive click. It was just the two of us now. I reached up, wiping a smear of blood from my split lip with the back of my thumb. I looked down at Chloe. She was sitting on the floor, her designer silk skirt twisted around her knees, staring at the closed door where her husband had just abandoned her. The camera of my mind zoomed in on her face, capturing the exact moment her perfectly curated illusion cracked. But true to form, Chloe could not face reality. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she smoothed her hair, instantly falling back into the only defense mechanism she knew: playing the victim. "Why did you have to do that?" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space. "Why do you always have to ruin everything, Zuri? You could have just signed the papers. It is just a house. But no, you had to humiliate Preston. You had to embarrass Mom and Dad. You are so bitter. You have always been jealous of me. You are just jealous that I married into a good family while you sit in this fortress all by yourself." I walked slowly toward my desk, leaning against the polished wood. I crossed my arms and let out a harsh, dry laugh. "Jealous?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air. "You think I am jealous of you, Chloe? Let us talk about your rich husband. Let us talk about this elite family of yours. Because from where I am standing, the Sinclair dynasty looks an awful lot like a cheap circus act." Chloe crossed her arms defensively, raising her chin. "You do not know anything about my life. Preston is a visionary. His company is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. He just needs a bridge loan." "A bridge loan," I fired back, stepping closer to her. "A bridge loan is what you get from a bank. You do not break into your sister-in-law's private safe to steal property deeds for a bridge loan. That is called a desperate felony. Tell me something, Chloe. If your husband is so incredibly wealthy, why is he trying to mortgage my house? If the Sinclairs are so rich, why did Beatrice's credit card get declined at the country club last month?" Chloe flinched, her eyes darting away. "You are making things up." "I do not make things up. I read data," I told her, my voice turning to ice. "You think I do not see the financial footprint of this family? You drive a leased Mercedes that is 2 payments behind. Your mother-in-law pays for her grocery deliveries with a credit card that has a 30% interest rate. And your visionary husband. He does not have a single legitimate investor for his startup. He is bleeding our parents dry. He convinced them to take out $40,000 in secret debt just to keep up appearances. That is a lie, Chloe shouted, her voice trembling. Preston takes care of me. He manages all the finances because he knows how to handle wealth. He controls your accounts, does he not? I pressed, stepping right into her personal space. I looked down at her shaking hands. He tracks every penny you spend. He questions every receipt. I bet you do not even have a debit card with your own name on it anymore. Open your purse, Chloe. Show me one credit card that you actually control. Chloe clutched her expensive leather handbag tightly against her chest, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. Stop it, Zuri. Leave me alone. Show me the wallet, Chloe. I reached out and grabbed the strap of her handbag. I did not pull hard, just enough to challenge her grip. Chloe panicked. She yanked her arm back with sudden, violent force. As she jerked away, the delicate silk sleeve of her blouse slid up past her elbow. I froze. The handbag slipped from my fingers, dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. My eyes were locked on her forearm. There, wrapped around her pale skin, was a massive, dark purple bruise. The discoloration was turning a sickly yellow at the edges, shaped perfectly like the grip of a large hand. The air vanished from the room. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Chloe gasped quickly, dragging her sleeve down her hands, shaking so violently she could barely grip the fabric. She took a step back, her back hitting the locked door. She squeezed her eyes shut and the dam finally broke. A ragged, agonizing sob tore from her throat. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the solid wood door, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of wrinkled silk and silent tears. "Who did that to you?" I asked. My voice was no longer loud, but it carried a lethal, quiet danger. Chloe hid her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. "It was an accident," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a pathetic, rehearsed rush. "He was just stressed. The investors pulled out. The bank called the loans. I asked him about a bill and he just grabbed my arm to get my attention. He did not mean to hurt me, Zuri. He is just under so much pressure." I knelt down on the floor in front of her. I reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her tear-stained face. "Look at me," I commanded softly. "Tell me the truth." Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with absolute terror. The perfectly crafted facade of the Sinclair family daughter-in-law was gone. In her place was a terrified, trapped girl. "We are broke, Zuri," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We are completely bankrupt. The Sinclairs lost their money years ago. Richard made terrible investments and Beatrice refused to change her lifestyle. They have been floating on credit and empty promises for a decade. Preston thought his startup would save them, but it is a shell company. He has been taking money from the employee pension fund to cover his gambling debts. He owes millions." I processed the information instantly, the puzzle pieces clicking into a horrifying picture. "And our parents?" I asked. "Preston manipulated them," Chloe confessed, choking on a fresh wave of tears. "He told them that if they helped him secure this last loan, he would make them executive board members. He made them feel special. He made them feel elite. But the lenders will not take his signature anymore. He needs clean collateral. If he does not get the $3 million by tomorrow, the creditors are going to destroy him." "Then let them destroy him," I said coldly. "You take your son and you walk away. I will hire the best divorce attorneys in the state. I will protect you." Chloe let out a desperate, panicked wail. She scrambled forward, grabbing the lapels of my blazer, pulling herself up until she was on her knees in front of me. "I cannot leave him, Zuri. You do not understand. He told me that if I try to take little Leo, he will use his family's connections to declare me an unfit mother. He said his lawyers will drag my name through the mud. He will take my baby away from me. I have no money. I have nowhere to go. Please, Zuri." She pressed her forehead against my chest, gripping my jacket as if she were drowning. "Please, just give him the house." Chloe begged, her voice raw and broken. "Just mortgage the property. You can afford it. You have so much money. If you do not give him the collateral, he will take his anger out on me. He will take my son. Please save me, Zuri. I am begging you." I looked down at the top of her head. This was Chloe, the golden child. The sister who was handed the world on a silver platter, now kneeling on the floor begging for her life. I felt a surge of profound disgust, not entirely directed at her, but at the absolute depravity of the people who had put her in this position. My mind worked with cold, calculated precision. If I just said no, if I simply threw Preston out and refused to sign the papers, the Sinclairs would not stop. They were desperate animals backed into a corner. They would pivot back to Marcus and Yvonne. They would bleed my parents dry, draining their retirement accounts, selling their cars, forcing them to take out second mortgages until there was nothing left but dust. And Preston would continue to use Chloe as a punching bag, holding her child hostage to maintain his fragile ego. A simple refusal was no longer enough. Defense was no longer an option. I needed to eradicate the threat completely. I needed to dismantle the Sinclair family brick by brick until they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I gently peeled Chloe's fingers off my blazer. I stood up, smoothing the fabric, my expression hardening into stone. I walked over to my desk and picked up my phone. I bypassed the smart home controls and opened my encrypted communication app. I dialed a number that was not saved in my contacts. It rang exactly twice before a deep voice answered. "Yeah, boss," DeAndre said. DeAndre was my lead financial forensic investigator. He was a brilliant corporate lawyer who left a white shoe firm to work exclusively for my cybersecurity company. He specialized in finding money that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. "Get to a secure terminal!" I instructed, my voice echoing with lethal authority. "We are going to war. I need you to initiate a full-scale financial sweep on the Sinclair family. I want everything. Richard, Beatrice, Preston, and his startup. I want to see every offshore account, every hidden shell corporation, every declined credit card, and every single penny he has embezzled from his employee pension fund." There was a brief pause on the line. DeAndre let out a low whistle. "A full sweep. That is going to trigger red flags across half the banks in the city." "Let them flag it," I said, looking over at Chloe, who was staring at me in shock. "Prepare the system. I want to know exactly who owns their debt. Because by this time tomorrow, I am going to buy it all." I ended the call with DeAndre and dropped my phone onto the polished mahogany surface of my desk. The adrenaline that had spiked during my confrontation with my father and the Sinclairs began to recede, leaving behind a cold and razor-sharp focus. I sank deeply into my ergonomic leather chair, sliding forward until the glow of my 5 curved monitors completely enveloped my field of vision. The ambient lighting in my locked office shifted to a dim, tactical blue, casting long, sweeping shadows across the walls. If anyone had been in the room, they would have seen me illuminated entirely by lines of scrolling data, the absolute master of my digital domain. The Sinclair family had made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at a successful Black woman and saw only a target. They saw my quiet demeanor and my lack of flashy designer labels, and they convinced themselves I was nothing more than a glorified IT technician. They truly believed I was a subordinate pushing keyboards for a living, someone easily intimidated by their country club bluster and aggressive entitlement. They were about to learn precisely why Aegis Cyber was valued at hundreds of millions of dollars and why the most powerful financial institutions in the world paid me to build their digital fortresses. I cracked my knuckles and brought up my primary command terminal. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with blistering speed. First, I needed to map the exact perimeter of Preston Sinclair's financial ruin. I ran his name and his so-called revolutionary startup through a series of proprietary databases I maintained for my corporate clients. The public records alone painted a pathetically desperate picture. His company had not brought a single viable software product to market in over 3 years. The flashy press releases and the glossy pitch decks he used to impress my gullible parents were nothing but smoke and mirrors. Preston was operating a textbook shell corporation, burning through initial seed capital on expensive office leases, catered lunches, and corporate retreats that produced absolutely zero revenue. But a demand for a $3 million bridge loan overnight was highly specific. That is not a number you throw around to cover a few missed payroll cycles. You demand a sum like that when someone dangerous is knocking at your front door. I needed to see what was buried beneath the surface. I bypassed the standard commercial firewalls protecting Preston's company network. The security protocols he had in place were insultingly weak, the kind of basic, off-the-shelf software a college intern could crack during a lunch break. Within 4 minutes, I had full administrative access to his internal servers. I pulled up the private corporate ledgers and began cross-referencing the outgoing transactions against the dark web data leaks I constantly monitored for Aegis Cyber. The Sinclair family name had appeared in a massive offshore banking leak 2 years ago. I had kept that specific encrypted file bookmarked out of sheer curiosity. Now I actively linked Preston's current IP addresses and routing numbers to those shadowy offshore accounts. The data began scrolling rapidly down my vertical monitor lines of raw code and transaction IDs, assembling a horrifying narrative. Preston Sinclair was not just a failed entrepreneur. He was a degenerate, out-of-control gambler. I traced a chaotic web of wire transfers leading directly from his startup's operational accounts to high-stakes online casinos and unregulated sports betting syndicates based in Macau and the Cayman Islands. He had blown through all of his initial investor capital 18 months ago. To maintain his lavish lifestyle, the leased luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, the illusion of elite superiority, he weaponized against my family. He had started borrowing heavily from predatory high-interest lenders. He was drowning in toxic debt, but the sheer depravity of his actions went far beyond simple bankruptcy. The real horror story was buried deep within the payroll data. I opened a secondary terminal and extracted the employee benefit ledgers. Preston's startup employed 42 people. Most of them were young, ambitious engineers and developers who genuinely believed they were sacrificing their time for the next big tech unicorn. I cross-checked their retirement pension fund contributions against the actual deposit records at the corporate holding bank. The accounts were completely empty. Disgust rolled through my stomach like a physical wave. Preston had established a sophisticated dummy routing protocol. Every single time the bi-weekly payroll was processed, the employee pension contributions were automatically diverted into a shadow account that he personally controlled. He was actively embezzling the retirement funds of his own staff to pay off his massive gambling debts. He was stealing the futures of 42 hardworking people just to keep his mother draped in designer pearls and his wife trapped in a mansion they could not actually afford. This was the man my parents worshipped. This was the man who had stood in my office barely an hour ago, looking down his nose at me, mocking my career and demanding I sacrifice my home to save his honor. He was actively committing massive federal crimes, looking at a minimum of a decade in federal prison. Yet he possessed the sheer unmitigated arrogance to believe he could use my hard-earned property as collateral to bail himself out of a federal indictment. I began writing a custom script to package all the transaction logs, the dummy routing numbers, the offshore casino receipts, and the falsified payroll documents into a secure encrypted dossier. This was the kill shot. I was not simply going to deny his ridiculous loan request and kick him out of my house. I was going to hand this airtight package of evidence directly to the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service. I was going to ensure Preston Sinclair left my house in handcuffs. The progress bar on my center monitor crept toward 99%. The satisfaction of impending absolute victory was just seconds away. I leaned back, taking a deep breath, ready to execute the final command. Then the sharp, violent vibration of my personal cell phone shattered the silence of the office. The device buzzed angrily against the wood of my desk. The screen illuminated, flashing a high-priority red alert notification from my primary wealth management bank. I picked it up, initially assuming it was a routine security ping triggered by my own aggressive high-bandwidth network activity. Instead, the bold text on the screen made the blood in my veins run instantly cold. It was a major transaction authorization request. Someone was actively attempting an emergency same-day wire transfer of $250,000 straight out of my private checking account. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I immediately pulled up my personal banking dashboard on my main monitor to trace the point of origin for the request. The destination routing number attached to the wire transfer belonged to Sinclair Enterprises. Someone was trying to hand Preston $250,000 of my money. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I ripped into the bank's security log, pulling up the exact login credentials used to bypass the first layer of authentication. It was an old, nearly forgotten joint account mandate. A useless relic from 14 years ago, back when I was an 18-year-old college freshman and had naively allowed my mother to be a secondary signer on my very first student checking account. I had moved my primary wealth to secure private banking long ago, but that old dormant linkage still existed, buried deep within the bank's legacy retail system. The person actively trying to drain $250,000 from my savings was not a sophisticated hacker. It was not Preston Sinclair. It was Yvonne. My own mother was standing somewhere inside my house, actively using my old college credentials, desperately trying to steal my money to save the very man who had just insulted her and the husband who had just assaulted her daughter. The heavy glass doors of the First Atlanta Depository parted as I marched straight into the marbled lobby. I did not stop at the teller line. I bypassed the plush waiting area and walked directly toward the glass-walled office of the branch manager. My heels struck the polished floor with a sharp, rhythmic intensity that caused several heads to turn, but I did not care who was watching. The digital alert on my phone was a flashing neon sign of absolute betrayal. $250,000. My mother had actually tried to steal $250,000 from me while I was locking her beloved son-in-law out of my home. Mr. Caldwell, the senior branch manager, stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his leather chair when he saw my face. He knew exactly who I was. Aegis Cyber held its primary corporate accounts at this institution, and my personal wealth management portfolio was one of the largest in his entire branch. I slammed my phone onto his mahogany desk and demanded an immediate freeze on all outgoing wire transfers. He scrambled to his keyboard, his face draining of color as he typed frantically to pull up my transaction logs. He stammered, his eyes darting nervously between his monitor and my hardened expression. He explained that a manual wire request had been submitted just 20 minutes ago, flagged as an urgent family medical expense. It was authorized by Yvonne using a joint account mandate. I forced him to turn his monitor around and pull up the original authorization paperwork. There it was on his screen. A scanned, yellowing document from 14 years ago. It was the basic student checking account my mother had forced me to open when I left for college. I had long since abandoned that account, but I had never officially severed the electronic linkage when I upgraded to my private wealth portfolio. My mother had kept that specific account number memorized for over a decade. She had waited for a moment of sheer desperation to exploit it. She had weaponized my teenage trust in a pathetic attempt to fund Preston Sinclair's fraudulent lifestyle. Cancel it. I ordered, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. Sever the link permanently. Revoke all secondary authorizations across every single account bearing my name. I want Yvonne and Marcus flagged for suspected fraud, and I want my entire portfolio secured behind a biometric lock immediately. While Caldwell was trembling and typing the override commands, sweating under the intense pressure of my gaze, I pulled my phone back off the desk. I hit the speed dial for my father. Marcus answered on the second ring. He did not sound apologetic. He did not sound ashamed of the fact that he had struck me across the face in my own home. He sounded breathless, frantic, and completely unhinged. I did not even give him a chance to speak. I asked him if he and Yvonne had truly lost their minds. I asked him how they could possibly justify attempting to drain my life savings behind my back just to pay off a white man's gambling debts. My father exploded through the speaker. The sheer volume of his voice forced me to hold the phone away from my ear. "You are an ungrateful, selfish child," he roared, the sound of his rage echoing slightly in the quiet bank office. He justified the attempted theft as an emergency family loan. He screamed that I was hoarding wealth while my own sister was drowning. "If Preston defaults on his obligations by tomorrow morning, Chloe will be thrown out onto the street," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He is on the verge of bankruptcy. Do you have any idea what that means for this family? The Sinclair name will be dragged through the mud. We will be publicly humiliated in Atlanta. Every single one of our friends at the country club will know that Chloe married a failure. We will be a laughingstock. I stood there gripping the edge of the mahogany desk, genuinely astounded by his priorities. You are willing to steal from your own daughter, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low, just so you do not look bad in front of a bunch of fake socialites. You would bankrupt me to protect Preston's fragile ego. You make plenty of money playing with your little computers, Marcus fired back, completely dismissing my entire career in one breath. You make a few pennies, you live alone, and you have no responsibilities. You should be honored to step up and save your sister. You owe this family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. Now you need to do your duty and protect Chloe's marriage. Call that bank manager right now and tell him to push the wire transfer through. If you do not fund Preston's company tonight, you are dead to us, Zuri. Do you hear me? Dead to us. In the background of the call, I could hear Yvonne crying loudly, wailing about how I was destroying their social standing and ruining Chloe's perfect life. They were a chorus of toxic entitlement, completely blinded by their desperate proximity to whiteness and old money. They were willing to sacrifice me on the altar of the Sinclair family without a second thought. I listened to my father's heavy breathing through the speaker. I waited for the familiar sting of rejection. I waited for the childhood desire for their approval to rise up and choke me. But as I stood in that sterile, air-conditioned office, I realized something profound. I did not feel a single drop of sadness. There were no tears left for these people. The biological tie between us had completely dissolved, burned away by their endless greed. The emotional manipulation that had governed my entire life simply evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. I am not calling the bank manager, Dad, I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, because I am standing right in front of him. The transfer is canceled. Your access is permanently revoked. And if either of you ever try to access my accounts again, I will personally hand the fraud charges to the district attorney. I hung up the phone right as Marcus started screaming another insult. I watched the screen go dark, severing my connection to them completely. I turned back to Caldwell. He was staring at me wide-eyed and pale, having clearly heard the shouting through the phone. It is done, Ms. Zuri, he said, quickly swallowing hard. The accounts are locked. No one can touch your money but you. Thank you, Caldwell, I replied smoothly, slipping the phone back into my pocket. Have a good afternoon. I walked out of the bank with the same kinetic energy I had entered with, stepping back out into the sweltering Atlanta heat. The sun glared down on the concrete, but I felt absolutely chilled. I did not get into my car immediately. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk and opened my encrypted communication app again. I dialed DeAndre. He answered immediately, the sound of rapid typing already echoing in the background of his line. I need an update, I demanded, watching the traffic flow past the financial district. The sweep is complete. DeAndre reported, his tone strictly business. You were right. Sinclair is drowning. He owes money to 3 different high-risk lending firms, 2 offshore casinos, and he is completely delinquent on his commercial real estate leases. The employee pension fund is entirely drained. The total liability package sits right around $12 million. The lenders are getting aggressive. They are actively looking to offload his bad debt to a collection agency just to recoup a fraction of their losses. Perfect, I said, my eyes scanning the Atlanta skyline. I stepped into the shaded interior of my car and closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the city. I leaned back against the leather headrest, a slow, predatory smile finally spreading across my face. Buy it all, I ordered DeAndre. Contact every single lender, every casino marker, and every commercial landlord holding Sinclair's paper. Offer them a premium to buy out his debt immediately. I do not care if it costs $15 million of my own cash. I want to own every single contract, at any cost. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, I want to be the sole owner of Preston Sinclair's entire miserable existence. I pulled my car into the secured underground garage of the glass and steel skyscraper that housed the downtown headquarters of Aegis Cyber. The elevator ride to the executive penthouse was completely silent, providing a brief sterile moment of absolute calm before the storm I was about to unleash. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped onto a floor that belonged entirely to me. The executive suite of Aegis Cyber was a vast open space bathed in harsh, unapologetic sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no antique Persian rugs here, no fake pearls, and no desperately leased luxury vehicles parked out front for show. This was a fortress built on pure, unadulterated intellectual capital. I walked past the rows of glass-walled conference rooms and the silent, highly focused teams of security analysts monitoring global network traffic. DeAndre was already waiting for me at the massive marble conference table in my private office. A sprawling array of digital tablets and heavily redacted physical dossiers were spread out across the pristine surface. He stood up as I entered his 6'4" frame, cutting an imposing figure against the Atlanta skyline behind him. DeAndre was not just my lead forensic investigator. He was a former federal prosecutor who had left a prominent white shoe law firm because he preferred hunting corporate criminals to defending them. He possessed a lethal legal mind and an absolute unwavering loyalty to me. "We have a situation," DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine caution. "I mapped out the entire financial acquisition strategy. I contacted the offshore holding companies, the high-risk venture capital lenders, and the casino syndicates holding Preston Sinclair's paper. And I asked, tossing my keys onto the table and taking the seat at the head of the boardroom. They are highly motivated to sell," DeAndre confirmed, tapping the screen of his primary tablet. "Sinclair has missed his last 4 minimum payment cycles. The lenders consider this debt completely toxic. They are willing to offload the entire portfolio to our private holding company at a slight discount just to clear their books. But Zuri, we are still talking about an enormous amount of liquid capital. Securing the exclusive rights to every single one of his loans, including the commercial leases for his fake startup, will cost us exactly $12.4 million in cash." DeAndre paused, resting his hands on the marble table, looking me dead in the eyes. "I need you to be absolutely certain about this. $12 million in cash to buy toxic debt from unregulated casinos and predatory lenders is a massive deployment of capital. You are essentially buying absolute garbage." "I am not buying garbage, DeAndre." I corrected him, my voice perfectly level. "I am buying a leash." I stood up from the table and began to pace the length of the sunlit office. The adrenaline from the bank had faded, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I looked out over the city, thinking about the woman who had just tried to authorize a fraudulent wire transfer using my name. "Do you know what my mother tried to do exactly 45 minutes ago?" I asked, keeping my gaze fixed on the bustling streets far below. She marched into the First Atlanta Depository and attempted to use a dormant college checking account mandate to wire $250,000 of my money directly to Preston Sinclair. She tried to rob her own daughter blind to cover the gambling debts of a man who just called me a keyboard pusher. DeAndre let out a sharp, disgusted breath. "I can have our legal team draft a formal fraud indictment against her by the end of the hour. We can hand her over to the district attorney." I shook my head slowly, turning back to face him. "A criminal indictment is too easy. It lets them play the victim. It lets them cry to their church friends about their cruel, heartless daughter who sent them to jail. No, I want them to feel the exact weight of their own choices. I want them to drown in the reality they created." I walked back to the table and leaned over the digital contracts. When I was 18 years old, I begged my parents for help with my college tuition. I had secured a partial scholarship, but I needed a small loan to cover my housing and textbooks. Do you know what my mother told me, DeAndre? He remained silent, knowing I needed to say the words aloud. She looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was wasting my time. I said, the bitter memory burning in the back of my throat. She told me I was just an ugly black girl glued to a computer screen. She said I lacked the grace, the beauty, and the social pedigree to ever make a real name for myself. She told me to stop dreaming and go find a basic clerical job because I would never ever be like Chloe. I tapped the screen of the tablet, bringing up the finalized contract for the debt acquisition. 2 years later, while I was working 3 minimum wage jobs, eating instant ramen, and coding the foundational architecture for Aegis Cyber, in a windowless dorm room, my parents took out a second mortgage on their home. They plunged themselves into massive, suffocating debt for one singular purpose. They threw Chloe a $200,000 wedding. They paid for imported orchids, a custom designer gown, and a country club reception just to impress the Sinclair family. They literally mortgaged their future to buy their golden child a seat at a table of fraudulent aristocrats. I picked up the digital stylus, twirling it between my fingers. For my entire life, they have treated me like a repulsive burden. They looked at my quiet nature, my lack of interest in their shallow social climbing, and my dedication to my work, and they branded me a failure. They still look at me today and see a pathetic low-level IT worker who got lucky and bought a nice house. I looked around the sprawling executive suite. They had absolutely no concept of the reality they were dealing with. Aegis Cyber was not a computer repair shop. It was a premier global cybersecurity contractor. We secured the data infrastructure for Fortune 500 companies, international banks, and federal agencies. The company had recently been valued by Wall Street analysts at nearly $500 million, and I, the ugly daughter who stared at screens, retained 80% sole ownership of the entire enterprise. I generated more liquid revenue in a single fiscal quarter than the entire Sinclair bloodline had ever seen in their collective miserable history. Authorize the transfer, I commanded, handing the stylus to DeAndre. Buy the debt. Transfer the $12.4 million from my primary capital reserve. Consolidate every single loan marker and lease under my private holding firm. By tomorrow morning, I want Preston Sinclair to wake up and realize that I am his sole, uncompromising creditor. I want the legal authority to seize his assets, liquidate his startup, and force him into absolute destitution the second he steps out of line. DeAndre smiled a sharp, predatory grin that matched my own. He took the stylus and tapped the authorization prompt. The screen flashed green. The funds were deployed. "It is done, boss," he confirmed. "You own him." We stood in the quiet of the office, the massive financial transaction completing in the digital ether. But before I could even take a breath of satisfaction, DeAndre's personal encrypted terminal chimed with a high-priority alert. He frowned, swiping across the screen to open the secure message. His expression shifted from predatory satisfaction to deep, immediate concern. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed. "Zuri, the front desk just intercepted a physical delivery for you," DeAndre said, his voice dropping an octave. A private courier bypassed the corporate mailroom and insisted on handing it directly to executive security. It was routed from the Sinclair estate. I held out my hand. "Bring it here." DeAndre tapped his terminal, authorizing security to bring the item up. Moments later, a heavily built security officer stepped off the elevator carrying a pristine, cream-colored envelope on a silver tray. He placed it on the marble table and immediately withdrew. I picked up the envelope. The paper was incredibly thick, reeking of old money pretensions. My name was written across the front in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the heavy cardstock invitation inside. DeAndre walked around the table to stand beside me, reading over my shoulder. It was a formal invitation issued jointly by Richard and Beatrice Sinclair alongside Marcus and Yvonne. The venue was the ultra-exclusive Buckhead Country Club, the very epicenter of Atlanta's high society, and the exact location where my parents had bankrupted themselves to host Chloe's wedding. The date was set for this coming Saturday evening, but it was the title printed in bold gold embossed lettering at the top of the card that made my blood run cold. A private family gathering to resolve outstanding issues and secure our future. DeAndre let out a harsh scoff, shaking his head. "They are out of their minds. This is a trap, Zuri. It is a blatant, highly coordinated ambush. They know they cannot break into your house again, and they know the bank cut off their access, so they are trying to drag you into their territory. They want to surround you with their elite friends and country club peers. They think you are socially awkward. They think if they corner you in a public high society setting, the social pressure and the intimidation will force you to cave." They are planning to publicly shame you into signing over the deed to your house. I stared at the gold lettering, my thumb tracing the embossed edges of the card. DeAndre was absolutely right. It was a classic narcissistic maneuver. They believed that because I preferred the quiet of my office to the loud performative vanity of their social circles, I was weak. They genuinely believed I would shrink under the glare of their wealthy peers and hand over my life savings just to avoid a public scene. They thought they were inviting a scared, obedient scapegoat to a slaughter. They had no idea they had just invited their executioner to dinner. I placed the invitation back down on the marble table and looked up at DeAndre. The coldness inside me solidified into something unbreakable. "Clear my schedule for Saturday evening," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Call my personal stylist and tell her I need something utterly flawless." DeAndre raised an eyebrow, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "You are actually going to walk right into their ambush." I picked up the tablet containing the newly acquired $12 million debt portfolio. "I am not walking into an ambush, DeAndre," I replied, my eyes locking onto the gold-embossed invitation. "I am attending a hostile takeover." The air inside the Buckhead Country Club was thick with the scent of aged bourbon, expensive floral arrangements, and desperate hypocrisy. I moved through the grand dining room with slow, deliberate steps. If a camera were tracking my movement, it would glide smoothly past the sea of carefully lifted faces, capturing the forced laughter, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the hollow eyes of Atlanta's self-proclaimed elite. These were people who measured their worth in zip codes and inherited wealth completely oblivious to the fact that their entire ecosystem was built on fragile lines of credit. I wore a tailored midnight blue silk suit that cost more than my parents' entire secret credit card debt. My personal stylist had understood the assignment perfectly. I did not look like a woman walking into an ambush. I looked like a woman who owned the building. My gaze drifted past the chandeliers and the string quartet, finally locking onto the far corner booth. There they were. The Steadicam of my vision zoomed in and stopped dead on the condescending, thin-lipped smile of Beatrice Sinclair. She was sitting next to her husband Richard, both of them radiating an unearned sense of aristocratic superiority. Across from them sat Preston, looking smug and relaxed, clearly believing his little trap was about to spring shut. My sister Chloe sat beside him, staring down at her untouched water glass, looking like a heavily medicated ghost. And rounding out this miserable tableau were my parents Marcus and Yvonne, practically vibrating with nervous energy. They had been summoned by their masters, ordered to drag their unruly daughter to the slaughterhouse. I approached the table in silence. The conversation died instantly as I arrived. Marcus shot me a warning glare, while Yvonne nervously adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes darting around the room to ensure none of her socialite friends were watching us too closely. "You actually showed up," Preston said, leaning back and resting his arm across the back of the leather booth. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket, playing the role of the successful tech visionary to absolute perfection. "I have to admit, Zuri, I thought you would hide in your little house." I slid into the only empty chair at the table, sitting directly across from Beatrice. "I did not hide, Preston," I replied, my voice a smooth, icy calm. "I simply took the time to ensure all my accounts were fully secured against unauthorized wire transfers." Yvonne flinched so violently she knocked her silver fork off the table. It clattered against the hardwood floor, echoing loudly in the tense silence. She turned an ashen shade of gray, refusing to meet my eyes. Preston frowned clearly, not understanding the reference, but Beatrice quickly took control of the narrative. She leaned forward, resting her diamond-ringed fingers on the pristine white tablecloth. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Zuri." Beatrice began, her voice dripping with venom, masquerading as Southern hospitality. "We are all adults here. We know why this family gathering was called. You have caused a significant disruption to my son's business operations. Your refusal to cooperate earlier this week was not only selfish, but it was also incredibly naive." I folded my hands in my lap. Naive? Beatrice's smile widened, but her eyes remained dead and predatory. She glanced at my mother, then back at me. Listen to me very carefully, Zuri. I know you want to prove you are not just a burden to this family. The word hung in the air. I looked at Yvonne. My own mother had sat in this very country club and complained to her wealthy white in-laws that her successful independent daughter was a burden. The absolute betrayal was staggering, but I did not let a single emotion cross my face. I know you want to feel important, Beatrice continued, emboldened by my silence. But you are playing a game you do not understand. My husband Richard is a founding member of this club. He plays golf with the managing directors of every major corporation in this city. He sits on the advisory boards of the very banks you probably fix computers for. Richard puffed out his chest, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Beatrice is right, he added, his tone laced with heavy paternalism. You are a mid-level IT worker. You fix routers and write code. You do not understand high-level corporate finance. Preston's company is a golden opportunity for this family, and you are standing in the way of progress out of sheer petty spite. Beatrice leaned in even closer, dropping her voice to a dangerous, threatening whisper. So here is how this is going to work. You are going to sign the property deeds over to Preston's holding company tonight. If you refuse, if you try to walk out of here and embarrass us again, I will personally see to it that your little career is over. I will make a few phone calls. I will ensure that not a single company in Atlanta ever hires a black woman like you in IT ever again. You will be blacklisted. You will be unemployable. You will lose everything you have built, and you will have no one to blame but yourself. The deep-seated overt racism masked as a business threat was breathtaking. They were so blinded by their own privilege, so convinced of their absolute superiority, that they truly believed they could snap their fingers and erase my entire livelihood. They thought I was a helpless employee, dependent on their social circle for a paycheck. I looked at my parents. Marcus was glaring at me, his jaw clenched tight. You heard her, Zuri? My father hissed, leaning across the table. Stop being an ungrateful wretch. If Preston's company goes under, Chloe will be thrown out onto the street. This family will be humiliated in front of all of Atlanta. Do you want us to be a laughingstock? You make a few extra dollars with your little computer job, so you need to step up and save your sister. Sign the papers and stop this nonsense right now. Yvonne finally found her voice, though it trembled with fear. Please, Zuri, just do what they say. Do not ruin this for us. Do not let them take everything away. They were begging me to let myself be ruined just to maintain the illusion of their wealth. My own parents were actively participating in my blackmail, validating Beatrice's racist threats, all to protect a man who was actively embezzling millions of dollars. Preston scoffed, clearly enjoying the spectacle of my family tearing me down. He reached inside his velvet jacket and pulled out a thick legal document. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding right to the edge of my plate. It was a full transfer of deed and a total equity mortgage agreement, naming his fraudulent startup as the primary beneficiary of my home. He tossed a silver pen on top of it. Sign it, Preston commanded, leaning back with an arrogant smirk. And maybe I will let you keep your little job. I stared at the contract. The room around us buzzed with the ambient noise of the wealthy elite enjoying their Saturday night dinners, completely oblivious to the extortion happening in their midst. I looked at the smug faces of the Sinclair family and the cowardly, desperate faces of my parents. I felt the familiar weight of their expectations, the lifelong demand that I make myself smaller so they could feel bigger. Slowly, deliberately, I reached out and picked up the document. I held it in my hands, feeling the crisp, heavy paper. I picked up the silver pen, rolling it smoothly between my fingers. Preston's smirk widened. Beatrice let out a soft, victorious sigh, exchanging a triumphant look with her husband. Marcus physically relaxed, his shoulders dropping as he believed his social standing had just been saved. I looked directly into Beatrice's cold, triumphant eyes and I smiled. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of an apex predator. You plan to blacklist me in Atlanta, Beatrice? I asked, my voice a soft, silken whisper that cut through the noise of the dining room like a scalpel. How coincidental. I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, allowing the sheer weight of her empty threat to hang over the table. Beatrice's smug smile faltered just slightly as she tried to decipher my complete lack of fear. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not look at the fraudulent contract Preston had thrown in front of me. Instead, I raised my right hand, extending 2 fingers in a crisp, silent gesture toward the edge of the dining room. The focus of the room seemed to physically narrow, pulling tight onto my face as my expression hardened into absolute unyielding stone. Beatrice let out a sharp, derisive scoff, offended that I had ignored her ultimatum. "What on earth are you doing?" she demanded, looking around the opulent room. "You cannot just snap your fingers and summon the staff in a place like this. You do not belong here, Zuri. You cannot afford a glass of water in this establishment, let alone order these people around." My father leaned forward, his face flushing with secondary embarrassment. "Put your hand down, Zuri," Marcus hissed through clenched teeth. "You are embarrassing us in front of the entire club. Stop acting like a child and sign the paper." I ignored him entirely. Within seconds, a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit rushed over to our table. He bypassed the junior waitstaff entirely. He did not look at Richard, despite Richard puffing out his chest and preparing to issue a complaint about my behavior. The man stopped directly to my left and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. It was Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the Buckhead Country Club. "Good evening, Ms. Zuri," Mr. Sterling said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent table. "It is an absolute honor to have you dining with us tonight. I wanted to personally thank you again for your firm's incredible work. The new security firewall your team established for our private member database last week has been functioning flawlessly. Our board of directors is immensely grateful for your personal oversight on the project." The atmosphere at the table shattered like fragile glass dropped onto concrete. Beatrice's jaw actually parted. Richard blinked, his eyes darting from the general manager to me, completely unable to process what he had just heard. My mother, Yvonne, let out a tiny breathless gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Marcus sat perfectly rigid, his aggressive posture collapsing as confusion washed over his features. "Firewall." Richard repeated, his voice sounding thick and suddenly unsure. "Sterling, what are you talking about? She is just a computer repair technician." Mr. Sterling stood up straight, offering Richard a polite but incredibly strained smile. "I am afraid you are mistaken, Mr. Sinclair. Ms. Zuri's company recently overhauled our entire digital infrastructure. She is one of our most valued corporate partners." "Mr. Sterling," I interrupted smoothly, keeping my eyes locked dead on Beatrice. "We will need a moment of privacy, but please keep the check ready. I have a feeling the Sinclair family will be closing out their tab very shortly." "Of course," Ms. Zuri Sterling replied smoothly. He bowed his head once more and retreated silently into the dining room. I turned my attention back to the matriarch of the Sinclair family. The false aristocratic armor she had worn for decades was suddenly looking incredibly heavy. I rested my elbows on the table, folding my hands together. "I am not a lowly IT worker, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a register so cold and precise it made Chloe physically flinch on the other side of the booth. "I do not fix routers, and I certainly do not work for a corporate help desk. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Cyber. My company is currently valued by Wall Street at nearly $500 million. I shifted my gaze to Richard, who was now gripping the edge of the table as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath him. "You play golf with the board members of First Atlanta Depository?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "That is a cute hobby, Richard. But it is my company that holds their exclusive cybersecurity contract. I personally designed the biometric encryption algorithms that protect their entire global vault network. They do not make a single major digital maneuver without my firm's direct clearance. So please, Beatrice, I beg you, pick up your phone right now. Call all of those powerful men you think you control. Try to blacklist me in Atlanta. I would love to hear them laugh you off the line." Beatrice's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone suddenly looked like a heavy chain dragging her downward. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, to throw another insult, but her throat was completely dry. My mother stared at me as if I were a stranger who had just teleported into the seat. "500 million," Yvonne whispered the words, slipping out in a horrified, breathless daze. "But you never said. You just play on those computers." "You never asked Mom," I replied, not breaking eye contact with the Sinclairs. "You were too busy bragging about Chloe marrying into old money to bother asking how I bought a multi-million-dollar estate in cash. You were too busy calling me a burden to realize you were insulting the only person at this table with actual wealth." Preston was vibrating. His face had turned a deep mottled purple. His breathing was heavy, his eyes darting frantically around the table as he watched his carefully constructed illusion of superiority burn to ash in seconds. The predatory smirk he had worn just moments ago had completely vanished. But I was not finished. I had promised DeAndre a hostile takeover, and I was going to deliver. "Speaking of your elite connections, Beatrice," I continued, my voice smooth and unrelenting. "Since I manage the security sweeps for First Atlanta Depository, I happen to have front-row access to their delinquent asset registry. It is truly fascinating reading. For example, did you know that the bank has officially rejected your latest request for a loan extension?" Beatrice choked on a breath, her hands flying to the table. "That is confidential private information. You are lying," she hissed, panic finally shattering her Southern Belle facade. "It was confidential," I corrected her, "until you decided to drag my family into a public dining room and threaten my livelihood. I know the bank is preparing to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on your Buckhead mansion by the end of the month. I know you have not paid property taxes in 3 years. I know you are drowning." Richard tried to stand up, his face a mask of furious indignation. "I will not sit here and be insulted by some arrogant—" "Sit down, Richard," I snapped, the sheer authority in my voice forcing him back into the leather booth. "I have not even gotten to the best part." I raised my hand again. From the shadows of the dining room archway, Mr. Sterling reappeared. This time he looked profoundly uncomfortable. He approached the table and held out a sleek black leather billfold, presenting it directly to Richard Sinclair. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Sinclair," the manager said, his voice hushed to prevent the neighboring tables from hearing, though the tension was already drawing stares. "But your Platinum American Express card was declined. I tried running it twice. I also attempted to process the 3 backup cards we have on file for your membership account. They have all been flagged for insufficient funds or have been locked by the issuer." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a fatal car crash. Marcus and Yvonne sat frozen in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were watching their idols, the very family they had plunged themselves into $40,000 of secret debt to impress, being exposed as total frauds. The Sinclair family was bankrupt. They could not even afford the overpriced steaks sitting half-eaten on their plates. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, a tear of pure humiliation leaking out and ruining her perfect makeup. Richard stared at the black leather billfold as if it contained a venomous snake. I reached across the table, picked up the fraudulent mortgage contract Preston had tried to force me to sign, and casually tossed it into the center of the table. "You were going to blacklist me, Beatrice?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and smiling. "What a coincidence. Because I just bought the very debt that is sinking your entire family," Preston snapped. The realization that I held his financial life in my hands, that his elaborate scam to steal my house was dead, broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. He let out a primal, guttural roar. He slammed his fists down onto the table with such violent force that the crystal wine glasses tipped over, shattering against the expensive china. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like fresh blood. "You bitch, are you playing me?" Preston screamed, his voice tearing through the elegant dining room. He lunged across the table. His large hands scrambled over the broken glass and spilled wine, reaching wildly for my throat. He did not care who was watching. He did not care about the country club rules. He was a desperate, ruined man, acting on pure violent instinct. Chloe screamed, shrinking back against the booth. Marcus yelled out in shock, but he was too slow to move. I did not flinch. I did not move backward. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my silk blazer, drew my phone, and held it up the screen, glowing brightly in the dim light of the restaurant. Stand perfectly still, Preston, I said. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was a commanding, lethal strike that froze him halfway across the table, his hands mere inches from my face. Preston hovered there, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on the glowing screen of my phone. "Do you want to know what I was doing while you were ordering your appetizers?" I asked, holding the phone steady. "I was compiling a digital dossier. I packaged the wire transfers from your offshore casino accounts. I packaged the dummy routing numbers. And most importantly, I packaged the digital ledger proving you have been actively embezzling millions of dollars from your own employees' pension funds to pay off your gambling syndicates." Preston's face drained of all remaining color. The rage in his eyes was instantly extinguished by absolute paralyzing terror. "Take one more step toward me, Preston," I whispered, staring into his panicked eyes. "Just one. And I promise you I will hit send on this email to the Federal Field Office of the FBI. Do you want to see how fast they can surround this country club?" Preston froze. His hands hovered in the air, trembling violently just inches from my face. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes was intoxicating. The illusion of his power, the arrogant bravado he had worn like a second skin, evaporated completely. He was not a tech visionary. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had already snapped shut over his leg. I kept the glowing screen of my phone perfectly steady, but with my free hand I reached down to the sleek leather briefcase resting against the leg of my chair. I unclasped the brass lock and pulled out a physical dossier. It was nearly 3 inches thick, bound tightly in a heavy black binder. With a flick of my wrist, I hurled the massive stack of paper directly at his chest. The binder struck Preston hard, knocking the remaining wind out of his lungs. He stumbled backward, collapsing into the leather booth as the binder burst open upon impact. Hundreds of pages of heavily redacted bank statements, casino markers, and wire transfer logs scattered across the table, covering the spilled red wine and the ruined china. "Look at it," I commanded, my voice slicing through the dead silence of the dining room. The entire axis of the room seemed to violently tilt, knocking the Sinclair family completely off balance. They stared at the scattered documents as if the pages were laced with poison. "That is the paper trail, Preston," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his pale, sweating face. "Every single transaction, every hidden routing number, every offshore shell company you set up in the Cayman Islands to hide your catastrophic losses. You did not just make a few bad investments. You systematically drained $4 million from your own employees' pension fund. You took the retirement savings of the very people who built your fraudulent company, and you burned it all at unregulated blackjack tables and sports betting syndicates." Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless sound, pressing her manicured hands against her chest. She stared at her son silently, begging him to deny it, to call me a liar, to maintain the fiction that they were untouchable. But Preston could not even look at her. He stared down at the documents, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. I did not stop. I did not give them a single second to breathe. I sent the complete digital version of that dossier to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. Exactly 30 minutes before I walked into this club, I stated smoothly. "As we sit here, federal agents are preparing the warrants. They are pulling your digital footprint. By Monday morning, they will be walking through the glass doors of your startup carrying boxes to confiscate your servers." The silence inside the Buckhead Country Club was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables had ceased their conversations, their expensive forks suspended in midair, watching the total destruction of one of their most prominent families. The wealthy love nothing more than watching the mighty fall, and I was giving them front row seats to an execution. "You are going to federal prison, Preston," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. "And because I now own every single piece of your legitimate corporate debt, I will be the first creditor in line to liquidate whatever pathetic scraps the government leaves behind. You are entirely, irreparably finished." Preston buried his face in his hands. A pathetic, whimpering sob escaped his throat. He was a broken man, reduced to a trembling shell in front of the very high society peers he had sacrificed everything to impress. But it was not the Sinclairs who broke the silence. It was my mother. Yvonne shot up from her chair screeching harshly against the polished hardwood floor. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure hysterical panic. But she was not looking at Preston with disgust. She was not looking at the criminal who had tried to steal her daughter's life savings. She was looking at me with absolute unfiltered hatred. "You have lost your mind, Zuri!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. Her hands clawed at the air as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "How could you do this? How is Chloe supposed to survive this? You are destroying her marriage. You are ruining her husband's family." I slowly turned my head to look at the woman who gave birth to me. The sheer audacity of her reaction was almost magnificent in its sickness. Even now, staring at definitive proof of federal crime, staring at the man who had tried to rob me blind, her only concern was the social standing of her golden child. I looked at Chloe. My sister sat frozen beside her weeping husband, staring blankly at the scattered bank statements. She looked like a hollow porcelain doll, completely devoid of any independent thought or substance. She had traded her entire identity for a wealthy last name, and now she had absolutely nothing left. "Chloe's survival is not my responsibility, Mom," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "Yes, it is!" Yvonne screamed, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. She stepped toward me, practically vibrating with toxic entitlement. "You have all this money. You have a company worth millions. You could have just paid his debts. You could have covered the $4 million and saved this family from public humiliation. You are a selfish, evil girl. You are willing to send your own brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary just to prove a point." I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I unbuttoned my silk blazer and faced my mother, standing tall and utterly unbothered by her hysterics. "Listen to yourself, Yvonne," I said, the coldness in my voice finally causing her to take a half step backward. "Listen to the absolute insanity coming out of your mouth. This man stole $4 million from innocent working-class people. He attempted to forge documents to steal my home. You attempted to aid him by committing wire fraud at my bank today. And your immediate response is to demand that I empty my corporate accounts to protect him from the consequences of his own felonies." I stepped closer to her, my height and presence forcing her to look up at me. "You do not care about Chloe's safety," I stated, stripping away the final layer of her delusion. "If you cared about Chloe, you would be dragging her away from a man who is about to be indicted by the federal government. But you are not doing that. You are screaming at me because you know that when Preston goes to prison, your country club membership is revoked. You know that when the Sinclair estate is seized by the IRS, you will no longer have a wealthy son-in-law to brag about at your book club. You would gladly let him bankrupt me, destroy my company, and leave me destitute as long as you got to keep pretending you were part of the elite." Marcus grabbed Yvonne's arm, trying to pull her back, his face pale with realization. He finally understood that I held the power to destroy them as well. If I handed over the security footage from the bank and the fraudulent authorization forms Yvonne had signed, she would be facing federal conspiracy charges right alongside Preston. Marcus looked at me, a silent, desperate plea in his eyes, realizing he had backed the wrong horse for his entire life. Yvonne collapsed against Marcus, sobbing loudly into his shoulder, wailing about how unfair the world was, completely oblivious to the destruction she had helped orchestrate. The table fell quiet again, save for Yvonne's dramatic weeping and Preston's muffled panic. I looked down at Beatrice. The matriarch of the Sinclair family sat perfectly rigid, staring straight ahead at nothing. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The reality of her impending poverty had finally short-circuited her brain. But Richard Sinclair was not ready to surrender. He was a man who had spent his entire life believing the rules did not apply to him. He believed that wealth and a recognizable last name granted him absolute immunity from the consequences of reality. Richard pushed his chair back and stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, lifting his chin and puffing out his chest. He glared at me, his eyes blazing with a mixture of profound arrogance and desperate cornered panic. He refused to look at the scattered evidence of his son's crimes. He refused to accept that a black woman he viewed as a subservient pawn had just outmaneuvered his entire bloodline. "You think you have won, you arrogant little bitch?" Richard growled, his voice carrying the deep, booming cadence of a man used to giving unquestioned orders. "You think throwing some papers on a table changes who we are? You have absolutely no right to threaten this family. We are the Sinclairs. We built this city. We sit on the boards of institutions you could never even dream of entering." He slammed his hand down on the table, ignoring the broken glass. "You think the FBI is going to come storming in here over a few missing funds?" Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound completely devoid of humor. "You are out of your depth, Zuri. We still have assets. We have the trust funds. We will liquidate the secondary properties. We will sell the commercial holdings. We will sell the entire Sinclair family mansion to cover the debt if we have to. We will hire the best defense attorneys on the eastern seaboard, and we will crush your little tech company into dust for defamation." Richard stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face, clinging desperately to his fading illusion of supremacy. "We have wealth you cannot even comprehend," Richard roared, his face turning crimson. "We will pay off the banks. We will pay off the pension funds. We will bury you in litigation until you are begging for mercy on the sidewalk. The police will not touch us. We are untouchable." His words echoed off the vaulted gilded ceilings of the Buckhead Country Club, hanging in the air like a desperate, pathetic prayer. For a fleeting second, Richard Sinclair actually seemed to believe his own delusion. He stood there with his chest puffed out, his face flushed a violent crimson, breathing heavily, as he clung to the phantom safety of a surname that had just been rendered entirely worthless. The surrounding tables had fallen deathly silent. Dozens of Atlanta's most prominent socialites, venture capitalists, and old money heirs had stopped eating their expensive crystal glasses, suspended mid-air, as they watched the spectacular public implosion of the Sinclair dynasty. Behind me, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining alcove swung open with a resounding, authoritative thud. If a camera had been slowly panning around my back in that exact second, it would have captured the magnificent, terrifying image of DeAndre stepping into the harsh light of the dining room. He did not look like a corporate attorney. He looked like the Grim Reaper dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. He moved with a slow, predatory grace, his 6'4" frame projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising power. Flanking him were two heavily built tactical security contractors from Aegis Cyber, their faces completely impassive, earpieces curled discreetly behind their necks. DeAndre came to a halt directly behind my right shoulder. He did not say a word. He simply leveled a cold, dead stare at Richard Sinclair, who suddenly looked very small and incredibly fragile. I remained seated, resting my hands lightly on the table, entirely unbothered by Richard's screaming. I tilted my head, studying him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. "Sell your assets." I repeated, my voice a soft, silken whisper that somehow carried enough acoustic weight to slice through the ambient noise of the entire restaurant. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. "Richard, who exactly do you plan to sell them to when you no longer own them?" Richard's mouth opened, a sputtering, incoherent sound escaping his throat, but no words formed. The arrogant fire in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a dark, creeping shadow of profound confusion. Beatrice let out a sharp, ragged breath, her hands trembling so violently that her diamond bracelets rattled against the edge of the table. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs gliding silently across the polished floor. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my silk blazer. Slowly, deliberately, I began to walk around the perimeter of the table. My heels clicked against the hardwood in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, a metronome ticking down the final seconds of their fabricated aristocracy. "You see, Richard?" I said, my voice gliding smoothly through the tense silence. "You operate under the tragically outdated assumption that wealth is tied to legacy. You believe that because your grandfather built that ridiculous, sprawling mansion in Buckhead, the brick and mortar will magically protect you from the consequences of your son's profound criminal incompetence. But modern finance does not care about your country club memberships. It does not care about your golf handicaps. It cares about leverage and liquidity. I walked past my sister Chloe. She was completely catatonic, staring blankly at the spilled red wine, soaking into the white tablecloth, her perfect designer dress, looking like a hollow costume. She had traded her entire identity for a wealthy last name, and now she was sitting in the ashes of that transaction. When I verified that Preston was bleeding his own company dry, I did not just notify the federal authorities. I continued my footsteps slow and methodical. I called my financial acquisition team. I had them pull the records on every single outstanding debt associated with the Sinclair name. The high-risk venture capital loans, the commercial real estate paper for his useless tech startup, the massive delinquent mortgages you quietly took out on your secondary properties just to keep up appearances. I stopped directly behind Beatrice's chair. I could smell the sharp metallic tang of her nervous sweat cutting through her expensive perfume. And let us not forget the casino markers, I whispered, leaning down slightly so my voice was right next to Beatrice's ear. She flinched as if I had pressed a hot iron to her skin. 3 separate offshore gambling syndicates held millions of dollars in highly toxic debt, all bearing your son's forged signatures. They were getting incredibly impatient, Richard. They were about to sell that debt to collection agencies who do not bother sending polite letters in the mail. I resumed my walk circling around the far edge of the booth, until I was standing directly across from my parents. Yvonne was hyperventilating, her hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Marcus sat perfectly rigid, his face an ashen mask of pure defeat. They were finally realizing the true scale of the monster they had provoked. So I made the lenders an offer. I stated, my voice echoing clearly. I offered to buy every single one of Preston's defaulted loans. I offered to buy the mortgages on your properties. I offered to purchase the casino debt outright. I gestured to DeAndre. Without breaking eye contact with Richard, DeAndre stepped forward and placed a sleek, heavily armored briefcase on the table. He snapped the brass locks open and withdrew a thick stack of freshly notarized acquisition contracts, every single page stamped with the gold seal of my private financial holding firm. He dropped them onto the center of the table. $15 million, I said the number, dropping like a guillotine blade onto the shattered remnants of the dinner party. $15 million in cold, hard, liquid cash, transferred and cleared exactly an hour ago. The banks were absolutely thrilled to offload your toxic paper. The offshore lenders practically threw a parade to get the garbage off their hands. Beatrice looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her pristine, carefully constructed Southern Belle facade disintegrated completely. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. You spent $15 million just to ruin us. Beatrice choked out her voice, a hollow, broken rasp. You spent a fortune just to destroy my family. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. $15 million is a fraction of my quarterly dividend, Beatrice. For me, it is a minor accounting adjustment. But for you, it is the price of your entire existence. I walked back to the head of the table, standing tall, radiating a cold, uncompromising authority. You cannot sell the mansion, Richard, because I hold the primary lien. You cannot sell the commercial properties because I hold the deeds. You cannot liquidate Preston's startup because I am the sole corporate creditor. Every asset you think you have, every piece of wealth you plan to use to defend yourselves from the federal government legally belongs to me. Yvonne let out a sudden piercing wail that shattered the quiet of the room. She scrambled out of her chair, lunging toward me, her face a mask of absolute toxic desperation. Zuri, you are insane! Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. You are out of your mind. How is Chloe supposed to live? You are destroying her marriage. You are ruining her husband's family. You have all this money. You could have just paid his debts. You could have given us the $15 million and saved this family from public humiliation. The sheer breathtaking entitlement of her demand hung in the air. Even now, staring at definitive proof of federal crimes, staring at the man who had tried to rob her own daughter blind, her only concern was the social standing of her golden child. She expected me to empty my accounts to fund their fraudulent lifestyle. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, my expression completely blank. You are not a mother, Yvonne. I said, my voice dangerously low. You are a parasite. You watched this family insult me, threaten my career, and humiliate me, and you demanded that I surrender my life savings to them. You would gladly let Preston bankrupt me and leave me destitute as long as you got to keep pretending you were part of the elite. You made your choice. Now you get to drown with them. Marcus grabbed Yvonne's arm, pulling her back before she could lunge at me again. He looked at me with a silent, desperate plea in his eyes, realizing he had backed the wrong horse for his entire life. But I offered him no mercy. I turned my attention to Preston. He had collapsed completely. He was slumped over the table, staring at the stack of acquisition contracts. He was a ruined, broken man reduced to a trembling shell in front of the very high society peers he had sacrificed everything to impress. I walked slowly toward him. I leaned forward, pressing my palms flat against the polished mahogany of the table, pinning the fraudulent documents he had tried to force me to sign beneath my hands. I lowered my face until I was mere inches from his, forcing him to look into my eyes. The smell of his terror was palpable. I am your sole creditor. My gaze dropped directly to Preston's hands. They were trembling so violently that the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist rattled against the polished mahogany table. The expensive watch, likely purchased with the very pension funds he had stolen from his employees, seemed to mock him now. I watched his fingers twitch and curl, desperately grasping at the empty air as if he could physically catch the unraveling threads of his life. I shifted my focus to his face. The transformation was absolute and utterly pathetic. The smug, untouchable aura of white aristocratic privilege that Preston had worn like a tailored suit his entire life had completely evaporated. His skin was a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The arrogant sneer had collapsed into a slack-jawed expression of profound, unadulterated terror. He was no longer the brilliant tech visionary. He was no longer the superior son-in-law. He was a cornered, hemorrhaging animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut over his neck. The entire dining room of the Buckhead Country Club erupted into a chaotic symphony of whispers. The heavy, stifling silence that had previously gripped the room shattered, as dozens of Atlanta's most prominent socialites, venture capitalists, and old money heirs finally processed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. These were the very people the Sinclair family had spent decades trying to impress the elite circle they had clawed their way into, and now those same peers were watching their public execution. I glanced past Richard's shoulder and saw a woman in a vintage Chanel dress at the next booth openly holding up her smartphone. The screen glowed brightly as she recorded the entire spectacle. 2 tables over a prominent real estate developer was furiously typing on his phone, undoubtedly spreading the news of the Sinclair bankruptcy to every country club in the metropolitan area. The social death of the Sinclair dynasty was being live-streamed in real time. "Zuri, please!" Preston stammered, his voice cracking into a high, reedy whine that barely sounded human. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw air into his panic-constricted lungs. "You do not understand. The pressure from the board, the venture capital firm, they were demanding returns. I just needed a little more time to make the money back. I can fix this. We can fix this. You are family. We are family. I will make you a full partner in the firm. We can manage the debt together." I let out a soft, echoing laugh that sliced through his desperate bargaining. "A partner?" I asked, tilting my head and studying him with clinical disgust. "You want to make me a partner in a heavily investigated bankrupt shell corporation that is currently hemorrhaging $4 million in stolen federal funds? You truly are delusional, Preston. I do not partner with criminals. I liquidate them." Beatrice let out a sudden, ragged gasp. She clutched her chest, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the expensive fabric of her designer dress as if she were having a physical heart attack. She collapsed forward, resting her elbows on the table and burying her face in her hands. Deep, guttural, ugly sobs tore through her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing her entire identity had just been incinerated. The country club luncheons, the charity galas, the sprawling estate, everything that made her Beatrice Sinclair was gone, replaced by the impending reality of a cheap apartment and the mocking pity of the women who used to envy her. "Richard, do something!" Beatrice wailed, her voice muffled by her hands. "Tell her she cannot do this. Tell her we will sue her. Call the lawyers." Richard stood frozen, his jaw working furiously, but no words came out. He looked at the stack of acquisition contracts pinned beneath my hands, bearing the gold seal of my holding firm. He looked at DeAndre, who stood behind me, like a monolithic statue of impending doom. Richard finally understood that he had absolutely no power left to wield. He could not yell his way out of this. He could not buy his way out of this. I turned my attention back to the weeping matriarch and her trembling son. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a register so cold and precise it made the air around the table feel freezing. "I own your mansion, Beatrice," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal clarity. "I own every brick, every crystal chandelier, and every blade of grass on that property. I own your company, Preston. I own your servers, your patents, and your entirely empty corporate bank accounts. You do not have a single dime to your name that does not legally belong to me." Preston shook his head frantically, tears finally spilling over his pale lashes and tracking through the sweat on his cheeks. No, you cannot do this. You cannot just take everything." "I can, and I did," I replied smoothly. "And because I am the sole lien holder on your primary residence, I am officially issuing my demands. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits into the trunks of your leased luxury cars and vacate my property. If you are still inside that house by tomorrow evening, I will have the county sheriff drag you out onto the lawn in front of all your wealthy neighbors." Beatrice let out another hysterical scream, violently shaking her head as she clung to Richard's arm. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. Chloe finally broke her catatonic state. She looked at Preston, her eyes darting wildly between his terrified face and the undeniable evidence of his embezzlement scattered across the table. Her perfect manicured life was dissolving before her eyes. She turned to our mother, reaching out with trembling hands. "Mom." Chloe sobbed, her voice high and panicked. "Mom, tell her to stop. Tell Zuri to stop this. We are going to lose everything." Yvonne stepped forward. Her face flushed dark purple with a rage so toxic it was almost suffocating. She opened her mouth to scream at me again, preparing to launch another tirade about how I was a selfish, evil daughter destroying her golden child's life. She raised her hand, pointing her finger at my chest, drawing a breath to deliver her ultimate condemnation. But she never got the chance to speak. A high, piercing sound cut through the heavy mahogany doors of the country club. It was faint at first, a distant, undulating wail echoing down West Pace's Ferry Road. Within seconds, the sound multiplied. It grew louder, sharper, tearing through the quiet elegance of the Buckhead neighborhood. The distinct, aggressive shriek of federal sirens. Preston's head snapped toward the front of the restaurant, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. The last remaining drops of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a literal corpse. The sirens converged on the country club, the sound turning into a deafening roar as multiple heavy vehicles screeched to a halt on the paved driveway outside. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room, the entire restaurant was suddenly bathed in the frantic, strobing flash of red and blue emergency lights. The harsh colors bounced off the crystal chandeliers, casting jagged shadows across the terrified faces of the Sinclair family. "They are here," Preston whispered, his voice completely hollow. He lunged backward, stumbling out of the leather booth in a blind, mindless panic. He scrambled toward the side exit leading to the kitchen, acting purely on the desperate instinct of a trapped animal. He did not make it 3 steps. DeAndre moved with terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly into Preston's path, blocking the exit entirely. The 2 heavily built tactical security contractors from Aegis Cyber moved in flawless synchronization, flanking DeAndre and forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and tailored suits. Preston slammed into them, bouncing off the security team like a child hitting a brick wall. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, scrambling backward like a crab, sobbing uncontrollably, as the heavy front doors of the country club were violently thrown open. Half a dozen agents in dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI flooded into the elegant lobby, their presence completely shattering the refined atmosphere of the establishment. I stood perfectly still amid the chaos, watching the federal agents march directly toward our table, their eyes locked on Preston cowering on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp satisfaction of absolute justice. I slowly turned my head to look at my parents. Yvonne and Marcus were standing frozen near the edge of the booth. They were not looking at the federal agents. They were not looking at their weeping, terrified son-in-law on the floor. They were looking at me. Their eyes were wide, their faces completely slack with a profound existential horror. They looked at the calm, unbothered expression on my face, the sleek corporate attorney standing behind me, and the $15 million worth of financial ruin scattered across the table. All their lives they had viewed me as weak as a disappointment, as a subservient pawn they could manipulate and discard at their convenience. Now standing in the strobing red and blue lights of the federal raid I had orchestrated, they finally saw me for what I truly was. They stared at me with pure, unadulterated terror, their bodies trembling as they looked at me like I was an absolute monster. I held my mother's horrified gaze, and for the first time in my entire life, I smiled. The lead federal agent did not hesitate. He gripped Preston by the collar of his bespoke suit, hauling his dead weight off the polished hardwood floor with brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed like a gunshot through the silent dining room. Preston's arms were wrenched behind his back, his face pressed roughly against the edge of the mahogany table, smearing his cheek with the spilled red wine. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice a flat, practiced monotone that completely ignored the opulent surroundings. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Richard Sinclair finally snapped out of his paralysis. He lunged forward, his face purple with outrage, raising a hand as if he could physically swat the federal agents away from his son. "Do you know who I am?" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking. "Unhand him immediately. I will have your badges for this. I will call the governor." A second agent stepped directly into Richard's path, resting a firm hand on his utility belt. "Sir, step back immediately," the agent commanded, his tone devoid of any respect for the Sinclair name. "If you interfere with a federal arrest, you will be joining him in the back of the transport vehicle. Do you understand me?" Richard froze his chest, heaving his eyes, darting frantically around the room. He looked at the surrounding tables. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, the people he played golf with, the people who attended his wife's charity galas, were all staring at him with undisguised disgust. They were holding up their phones, recording his ultimate humiliation. No one stepped forward to help him. No one cared who he was. In the brutal hierarchy of their world, a bankrupt criminal was worse than a ghost. Richard slowly lowered his hands and stepped back, thoroughly defeated. Preston, thrashing against the grip of the two agents holding him, realized there was no escape. The reality of federal prison, of losing his startup, his wealth, and his freedom finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He could not attack me. I was shielded by DeAndre and the tactical team. He could not attack the agents, so like the coward he truly was, he turned his venom on the weakest target in the room. Preston twisted his neck, his eyes wild and bloodshot, searching the wreckage of the dining booth until he found his wife. "This is your fault!" Preston screamed, his voice tearing from his throat in a ragged, hysterical shriek. The focus of the room shifted violently, a rapid whip pan tracing the invisible toxic line from Preston's snarling mouth directly to Chloe. She was standing near the edge of the booth, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "You useless, pathetic gold digger!" Preston roared, fighting against the agents as they began to drag him toward the front doors. "You think I wanted to steal? You drove me to this? You and your constant whining about country club dues, your designer bags, your stupid luxury vacations, you drained me dry. You are nothing but an empty, shallow accessory. And now you have nothing. You hear me, Chloe? You are nothing without my name." Chloe physically recoiled as if he had struck her across the face. The verbal assault was a public disembowelment, stripping away the last remaining illusion of her perfect marriage. Preston was exposing the ugly transactional nature of their relationship to the entire high society crowd. He was not just leaving her, he was actively trying to destroy her social standing on his way down. "Enjoy the gutter, you stupid bitch!" Preston yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as the agents finally dragged him through the glass double doors and out into the strobing red and blue lights of the parking lot. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off his screams. Inside the dining room, the silence was suffocating. Chloe stood perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds. Her pristine, carefully curated aristocratic facade fractured, splintered, and then collapsed entirely. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the hardwood floor, landing hard amid the shattered crystal wine glasses and the scattered damning bank statements. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, curling into a tight ball, and let out a sound of pure primal agony. It was the sound of a woman mourning the death of the only identity she had ever known. Yvonne took a hesitant step toward her crying daughter, but Marcus grabbed her arm, holding her back. They were both paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster, completely unsure of how to navigate a situation where their primary source of social leverage had just been hauled away in handcuffs. I looked down at my younger sister. For years, Chloe had mocked me. She had belittled my career, insulted my appearance, and gladly participated in our mother's relentless campaign to make me feel like an inferior outsider. She had traded her soul for a zip code and a diamond ring, believing that proximity to wealth made her untouchable. Now she was sobbing on the floor of a country club, publicly discarded by the man she had sacrificed her dignity to keep. I raised a hand, signaling DeAndre and the security team to hold their positions. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I stopped directly in front of Chloe. I looked down at her shaking shoulders. I did not feel the triumphant joy I had anticipated. I felt only a cold, clinical pity for a girl who had been raised to value everything that did not matter. I knelt down the fabric of my silk blazer, brushing against the scattered documents. I reached out and firmly grasped Chloe's arms, lifting her off the floor. She was surprisingly light, trembling like a fragile leaf caught in a hurricane. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked at me, her eyes filled with shame, fully expecting me to deliver the final, crushing insult. She expected me to revel in her destruction, just as she had always reveled in my perceived failures. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a crisp, heavy envelope sealed with the insignia of my legal firm. I pressed the envelope directly into Chloe's trembling hands. "Sign it, Chloe," I commanded, my voice dropping to a firm, unyielding register that demanded absolute attention. Chloe blinked, her breath catching in her throat as she stared down at the thick envelope. What is this?" she stammered, her voice thick with tears. "It is your exit strategy," I stated smoothly. "Inside that envelope are fully drafted divorce papers. They are already notarized and filed with the state. I also included the confirmation documents proving that I have completely frozen every single joint banking and investment account you hold with Preston." Chloe looked up at me, uncomprehending. "You froze my accounts," she whispered, panic flaring in her eyes again. "But how will I froze them to protect you," I interrupted, my tone slicing through her panic. "Preston committed federal wire fraud and embezzlement. When the Department of Justice begins their asset forfeiture process tomorrow morning, they will seize everything attached to his name. Because I locked those joint accounts under the authority of my corporate holding firm hours ago, the federal government cannot touch your personal assets. I firewalled your money before the FBI even drafted the arrest warrant." Chloe's jaw parted slightly. She stared at me, the realization slowly washing over her. While she had been sitting at this table, treating me like a peasant, while her husband had been plotting to steal my home, I had been quietly, methodically shielding her from federal ruin. But I was not finished. "Open the envelope," I instructed. Chloe fumbled with the heavy paper flap, tearing it open. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Beneath the divorce filings was a heavy embossed deed printed on official county paper. She stared at the bold lettering at the top of the page, her eyes scanning the text. I bought the original Sinclair family acreage in Buckhead, I explained, keeping my voice low so only she could hear. When I acquired their bad debt, I took possession of the undeveloped land Richard had been trying to sell off to commercial developers. It is prime real estate. And as of 45 minutes ago, I transferred the deed entirely into your name. It is legally yours, free and clear of any Sinclair encumbrances. Chloe stopped breathing. She looked from the deed to my face, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. Zuri, this land is worth millions. Why? Why would you do this? Because you are my sister, I replied, my expression softening just a fraction. You traded your entire life to impress people who viewed you as disposable. You let Mom convince you that a wealthy husband was the only measure of your worth. But you are smarter than this, Chloe. You just forgot who you were. I tapped the deed in her hands. Sell it, I said, my voice projecting a quiet, absolute authority. Sell the land to the highest bidder. Take the capital. Divorce that criminal. Go back to college, finish your degree, and start over. Build a life that actually belongs to you, so you never have to sit at a table and let a man degrade you again. Chloe stared at me, her eyes overflowing with a fresh wave of tears. But these were not tears of humiliation or panic. They were tears of profound, shattering gratitude. The false aristocratic mask she had worn for years completely dissolved, leaving behind the younger sister I used to know before the toxic influence of our mother poisoned our relationship. Zuri, I am so sorry, Chloe choked out, her voice breaking completely. I am so sorry for everything. I was so awful to you. I was so stupid. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around my neck and burying her face in my shoulder. She held on to me as if I were a life raft in the middle of a violent ocean, sobbing out years of apologies and regret. I hesitated for a brief second, the years of distance and resentment standing between us. But then I slowly raised my arms and hugged her back. It was a rare, genuine moment of vulnerability, a silent truce struck in the ashes of the Sinclair Empire. For the first time in my life, I felt like I actually had a sister. But the fragile peace lasted for exactly 5 seconds. A violent, frantic commotion shattered the moment. Yvonne shoved her way past Marcus, her high heels scrambling against the hardwood floor. She practically sprinted toward us, her eyes wide and glittering with a manic, feverish intensity. She did not kneel to comfort Chloe. She did not ask if her youngest daughter was okay. Instead, Yvonne forcefully wedged her hands between us, shoving her crying, traumatized daughter roughly to the side. Chloe stumbled backward, nearly falling again, but Yvonne did not even glance at her. Yvonne threw her arms wide open, launching herself at me with a sickening, theatrical display of maternal affection. "Oh, Zuri, my darling, beautiful daughter." Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the restaurant, loud enough to ensure every wealthy patron still watching could hear her. She grabbed my shoulders, pulling me toward her, her face contorted into a mask of aggressive, desperate joy. "I knew you were brilliant," Yvonne cried, her hands clawing at my silk blazer. "I always knew you had a gift. You saved our family. You defeated those awful people and secured our future. Come, darling. Let us leave this dreadful place. Let us go home right now, and I will cook your absolute favorite meal. We have so much to celebrate." I stepped backward. My movement was so sudden, so sharply defined that Yvonne stumbled forward. Her grasping hands swiped through empty air, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly against each other. I did not just step away to avoid her embrace. I raised my hand and firmly, decisively swatted her manicured fingers away from the lapel of my silk blazer. The physical rejection hit her like a kinetic strike. She gasped loudly, clutching her chest, as if I had just driven a physical blade through her ribs. I stared at her. If she was expecting to see rage or a lingering desire for maternal approval in my eyes, she found absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in me. There was no sadness. There was only a vast, chilling emptiness when I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect me from the very predators they had invited into my life. "Celebrate," I repeated. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. "Save our family." I took another measured step back, ensuring the physical distance between us was absolute. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, the wealthy patrons of the Buckhead Country Club watching this spectacular familial collapse with rapt attention. "When you walked into my bank this morning, Yvonne," I said, my voice projecting with lethal clarity across the ruined dining room. "When you sat in that plush leather chair and actively tried to use an outdated power of attorney to drain my accounts and hand my entire life savings over to the man who was just hauled away in federal handcuffs. Did you think we were a family then?" Yvonne's mouth opened and closed in rapid succession. Her face flushed a mottled, ugly purple. "But Zuri, I did not know the truth. I thought he was investing it for you. I thought he was helping you grow your little business into something real." "You did not care," I snapped, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. "You just wanted to buy your way into Beatrice Sinclair's good graces. You wanted to prove that you belonged at this table so badly that you were willing to sacrifice your own daughter to pay the admission fee." I turned my cold, unyielding gaze to my father. Marcus stood paralyzed by the edge of the leather booth, his shoulders slumped, his aggressive posture completely broken. "And you, Marcus," I continued. "When you sat at this very table 20 minutes ago and called me a child, when you told me I was a burden and an embarrassment to the Sinclair bloodline, did you think I was your daughter then? Or was I just the embarrassing computer technician making your wealthy new friends uncomfortable?" Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He took a hesitant step forward, holding his hands up in a pathetic, groveling gesture of surrender. "Zuri, please listen to reason," he pleaded. His voice trembled with a desperate, sickening sweetness he had never once directed at me during my entire childhood. "We were blinded. We were completely tricked by the Sinclairs. They lied to us about their wealth, about their connections, about everything. We only did what we thought was necessary to protect Chloe. We are your parents. We were just trying to protect your sister from financial ruin." I did not let him finish his pathetic monologue. I cut him off with a laugh so sharp and devoid of humor that it made him physically flinch backward. "You did not want to protect Chloe," I stated, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You wanted to protect the illusion. You wanted to protect the country club invitations, the luxury cars you cannot afford, and the upper-class fantasy you have spent your entire lives violently craving. You threw me to the wolves because you thought Preston Sinclair was your golden ticket to the top of the social ladder." I looked down at Chloe, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor, clutching the deed to the Sinclair estate tightly against her chest. She was watching our parents with wide, devastated eyes. For the first time in her life, she was seeing them with the same brutal, unfiltered clarity I had possessed for years. I gave the Sinclair estate to Chloe. I continued, returning my attention to Marcus and Yvonne. The land under their ancestral home is now entirely in her name. It is up to her whether she sells it to commercial developers for millions or keeps it as a trophy. She has the capital to start over. But as for the two of you, I paused, letting the silence stretch out, savoring the absolute suffocating panic pooling in my mother's eyes. "That $40,000 in secret credit card debt you racked up trying to buy designer clothes to impress Beatrice Sinclair?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, as Yvonne let out a strangled gasp. "The debt you tried to hide by taking out a second mortgage on your house? The debt you were hoping Preston would magically pay off once he stole my company? I am not paying it." Yvonne let out a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "Zuri, you cannot do this. We will lose the house. The bank will foreclose on us by the end of the year. We are your parents. You have $500 million. 40,000 is absolute pennies to you." "It is pennies to me," I agreed smoothly. "But it is everything to you. So I highly suggest you both go home and update your resumes. You are going to need to get entry-level jobs to pay off your own delusions." Yvonne lunged forward again, screaming my name, her hands reaching wildly for my jacket. DeAndre intercepted her effortlessly. He stepped smoothly between us, his massive frame creating an impenetrable wall. Yvonne slammed her fists against his chest, wailing and sobbing, but DeAndre did not even blink. He simply looked down at her with professional, icy disdain. I turned my back on them. I did not look at the shattered crystal on the floor. I did not look at Richard and Beatrice Sinclair, who were sitting in stunned, catatonic silence in the ruined booth, contemplating their new reality of absolute poverty. I did not look at my father, who had dropped to his knees, burying his face in his hands as he wept. I simply adjusted my silk blazer, lifted my chin, and walked toward the exit of the Buckhead Country Club. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a steady, victorious rhythm. The heavy double doors swung open as I approached. I stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air, leaving the hysterical, echoing screams of Yvonne and Marcus behind me to ring out through the dining room. DeAndre fell into step beside me as we walked toward the waiting town car. The crisp night air felt incredibly clean, washing away the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the country club. Behind us, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers continued to strobe against the white columns of the building, a silent, flashing testament to the empire I had just meticulously dismantled. I slid into the back seat of the car, the heavy door closing with a solid, definitive thud. I did not look back at the restaurant. I did not look back at my family. I simply gave DeAndre a nod, and we drove away from the wreckage of the Sinclair dynasty into the quiet Atlanta night. 3 months is a remarkably short amount of time, yet it proved to be entirely sufficient to watch false kingdoms burn completely to ash. Preston Sinclair's descent was swift, public, and absolutely merciless. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a lenient plea deal, and his high society connections suddenly suffered from collective amnesia the moment his accounts were frozen. Without his stolen wealth to shield him, he was just another white-collar criminal standing in a courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. The trial was brief. The evidence I had provided the FBI was irrefutable. He was convicted of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forging federal documents. The judge, clearly unimpressed by his crying and desperate apologies, handed down an 8-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The man who had once sneered at my career, who had tried to steal my life's work to fund his delusions of grandeur, was now reduced to a sterile cell in a designated inmate number. His parents, Beatrice and Richard, experienced a social death that was almost surgical in its precision. I kept my promise. Exactly 24 hours after that dinner, my legal team oversaw their eviction from the sprawling Buckhead estate. The mansion was immediately liquidated to recoup the toxic debts I had purchased. Stripped of their assets, their company, and their precious surname, Richard and Beatrice were forced to relocate to a cramped, low-rent apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The country club promptly revoked their membership. Their wealthy friends stopped returning their calls, treating their bankruptcy like a contagious disease. Beatrice, who had once spent her afternoons hosting charity galas and dripping in diamonds, was now just an anonymous, bitter woman hauling her own groceries up 3 flights of stairs. They became ghosts in the very city they had once tried to rule. Surprisingly, the only person to emerge from the ashes with any shred of dignity was my sister Chloe. When I handed her the deed to the undeveloped Sinclair land, I fully expected her to squander it. Instead, she surprised me. She filed for divorce the morning after Preston's arrest, legally severing herself from the Sinclair name and the ensuing scandal. She sold the prime real estate to a commercial developer for a substantial sum, but she did not use the money to buy designer bags or chase another wealthy husband. She used the capital to completely sever her financial ties to our parents. She re-enrolled in college to finish her business degree and opened a small, thriving floral boutique in Midtown. For the first time in her life, she was calloused, exhausted, and genuinely happy. She was building something that actually belonged to her, and we had slowly begun texting each other again, taking tentative, careful steps toward a real sisterhood. My parents, however, were not so fortunate. Yvonne and Marcus had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset, a scapegoat they could sacrifice to protect their upper-class illusions. When I refused to pay the massive credit card debts they had secretly accumulated to impress Beatrice Sinclair, their financial house of cards collapsed. The second mortgage they had quietly taken out to fund their lavish, fabricated lifestyle defaulted. The bank was completely unforgiving. Within 2 months, they were forced to pack up their belongings and move out of the comfortable suburban home I had grown up in. The sheer humiliation of the foreclosure was compounded by the fact that their social circle, the people they had desperately tried to impress by throwing me to the wolves, completely turned their backs on them. To survive and pay off the crippling mountain of consumer debt they had amassed, My parents were forced to enter the workforce at the bottom. Marcus, who had always prided himself on his white-collar arrogance, took a job as a shift manager at a local hardware store. Yvonne, the woman who had sneered at my business and demanded I empty my bank accounts for her comfort, was now working as a retail associate at a mid-tier department store. She spent her days folding clothes and serving the very women she used to gossip with at luncheons. They were forced to swallow their toxic pride and endure the brutal reality of the working class they had always looked down upon. As for me, I sat in the corner office of my acquisition firm, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out before me, vast and full of opportunity. I had protected my empire, severed the parasitic ties of my past, and proven that my worth was never dictated by the people who failed to see it. I took a sip of my coffee, turned back to my monitors, and got back to work. The Atlanta skyline stretches out beyond the floor to ceiling windows of my penthouse living room, a glittering sea of amber and white lights against the velvet dark. I sink back into the plush velvet of my armchair, listening to the ambient hum of the city far below. The quiet in this room is absolute. It is not the tense, suffocating silence that used to hang over my parents' dining table, thick with unspoken resentments and desperate calculations. It is the deep, resonant stillness of total, unshakable peace. The burning anger that fueled my ascent for so many years has completely evaporated. In its place is a clean, solid foundation of clarity. I do not spend my days thinking about Marcus stocking hardware shelves or Yvonne folding sweaters in a department store. I do not waste a single thought on the sterile walls of Preston Sinclair's federal prison cell. They are simply ghosts, banished to the lives they ultimately designed for themselves. My energy now belongs entirely to the future. Chloe and I meet for coffee every Sunday morning at a small cafe near her floral shop. The transformation in her is nothing short of miraculous. She no longer wears the heavy armor like makeup or the restrictive designer dresses that defined her time as a Sinclair. When I watched her arrange a massive centerpiece of wild orchids yesterday, her hands were stained with soil, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot. She offered me a genuine, unpolished smile that reached all the way to her eyes. We do not pretend our ugly history never happened, and we do not force a manufactured closeness. Instead, we are building a real sisterhood, honest and slow, brick by painstaking brick. She traded a gilded cage for the terrifying freedom of the real world, and she has never looked stronger. I swirl the dark red wine in my crystal glass, watching the liquid catch the reflection of the streetlights outside. For decades, the people who were supposed to protect me used the concept of blood loyalty as a weapon. They used to say this is family business, wielding those exact words, to silence my objections, to bind my hands, and to demand that I endure their endless chawdap with a grateful smile. They truly believed their dirty money, their stolen assets, and their fabricated privilege could crush a black woman who had clawed her way out of the mud with her bare hands. They thought I would bow to their country club aristocracy because society told them I was beneath them. But they were profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Wealth is not a shield against consequence, and loyalty is absolutely never a suicide pact. I raise my glass toward the sprawling, illuminated city, a silent toast to the girl who survived and the woman who conquered. Family business sometimes is exactly that. It is having the cold, unwavering resolve to sweep away the rotten, toxic pieces yourself, clearing the ground to build a brand new empire. Your own. Cheers. The screen cuts to black.